most of the towns, or all the towns I represent, aren't able to qualify, certainly not to the same magnitude. And that's a source of revenue that they get, that they're able to utilize for their budgets. That we're sort of, and obviously is an issue that we can't really affect much at the state level. I would say, I think a piece needs to be talked about. There's always a debate about trying to find additional dollars. And I think healthcare was a way of maybe trying to find a way of saying, is there a way of alleviating costs? Bruce has worked on some accountability pieces. I know the superintendent is here, and he can probably tell you how much time he and the principals and administrators have to spend on filling out reports. And that takes, and I'm sure that's only gotten worse over the years. And that's a tremendous use of resources. That if there was some way of alleviating that or streamlining that, would save dollars. And ultimately, wherever we get the dollars from, whether it's the property taxpayer in North Reading or it's the taxpayer at the state level, there's an ability to go to the well so many times, so you have to find a way of trying to alleviate some of those costs. One of the bills that Bruce and I have filed is if the town goes and buys, the town government goes and buys something, they don't pay a sales tax. But if they go put gas in the town vehicles, they pay a gas tax. And our point is, why do we pay a gas tax, to go to the state to then potentially redistribute, because it just gets drained out? Why not save the cities and towns that? I mean, and annualized statewide, maybe $15 million. Not necessarily a lot of money, but it's the idea of why are we charging this tax off? And some would say, well, if you don't have cities and towns pay it, it's a disincentive to go and looking for green vehicles. I would say, even if you take the gas tax off, $4 a gallon is going to be an incentive for cities and towns looking at having more efficient vehicles anyway. So I think that's sort of a false argument.
Let me just touch, if I can, on a couple of things. Senate budget debate is a little bit different than House budget debate. We are not as handcuffed in terms of the way we do it. We'll have a deadline for amendments, but those amendments are much more free-ranging. We aren't limited as to the substance that we can offer. And just before we move on in the conversation, I can tell you, if it is not law by the time we take up the budget, I will offer the adequacy study as an amendment to the budget. And we'll be looking for your help to get that passed. That will not be easy, but that's one of the things that I'll be looking at. One of the other things that we'll both be looking at is, can we reorient some of that spending, assuming that the Ways and Means Committee budgets look relatively like what the governor's budget looks like. Will we be able to reorient some of that new spending to Chapter 70? Now that's going to be easier for us in the Senate than it is in the House. It's going to be almost impossible for Brad and his House colleagues, because they won't be allowed to offer an amendment that adds money to Chapter 70. But we will, and we'll be looking to do that. And if we're successful, that means we'd go into a conference committee, 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate, that work out the 2 different versions of the budget, and we'd have to fight for those changes there. But at least to get on the playing field is going to be pretty important. And so those are 2 of the concrete things that we're looking at, in addition to trying to capture some more money for SPED through Medicaid. That's going to be very important. And we'll try to let you know when those amendments come up in as much advance time as we can, so that you can work on it. I know last year we worked on the adequacy study a lot, but I want you to know that it will be filed. And so hopefully we'll be able to move it along, because we can't get an accurate gauge of what we should be spending unless we do a study like that. Now, in some circles, I've been criticized for advocating for the study, because people say, well, a study is a delay and it puts things off. Well, in some respects, that's true. And one of the things that Brad and I understand is the kids get one chance at the 1st grade, the 2nd grade, the 3rd grade, the 4th, and they can't wait while we do all these things. So that's why we have sort of a bifurcated approach. We look at short term, trying to do things like we did with the $150 million back to cities and towns, but we also look at the long term. Because if you look at the history of Chapter 70, there have been many changes, and usually they begin well in advance of when they actually occur. Someone files a lawsuit, a study gets issued, a business group comes together and says, we got to change things. So if we're going to make long-term substantial change, we need the study. But we aren't lost on the notion that we have to help kids now that are going through our school system, because they don't get a second chance at the 4th grade or the 3rd grade or any of that educational experience.
I mean, ed reform was basically because of a lawsuit.
There was.
And then there was another lawsuit, Hancock, that looked at basically the adequacy of the court. And the court said, well, they're making progress, sort of, we'll hold off and intervene further. I'm assuming that at some point in time that'll get revisited again.
Well, the history of this has, I believe there was a lawsuit that originally was filed in '78, then there was another one in '88, and then he had the Hancock case. And in all of those cases, communities challenged whether or not the Commonwealth was meeting its constitutional mandate, because we actually have a provision of our Constitution that says we must provide education to students. And so the question has always been, are we meeting that mandate? And if you look at what's happened with the formula, a lot of times it has been in response to those lawsuits. For instance, before the Education Reform Act of 1993, we used to do something called EEOG. David, you may remember this, Equal Educational Opportunity Grants. And the notion of those was to fill in the gaps to make everyone equal. Well, that didn't work very well. So then the lawsuit is actually, in many respects, the one continuous one that keeps getting revived. And so then in '93, we came back with this formula and said, this is the way we're going to do it. And now the governor has indicated to us that the Readiness Project, which is this big, cumbersome bureaucracy, is lumbering forward towards something, and we don't know what that something is going to be.
And they may very well be looking at the formula.
Yeah.
Yes, there was no subcommittee for mentioning that that's, it said financing. One of the subcommittees was focusing on, long-term funding. But it didn't, specify, and that was probably one of the smaller subcommittees. But I think you hit on a lot of these, getting back to, time slots of what we're trying to do and accomplish and how it is effective.
Can I just touch on a couple things? You have the mention of the fall ballot question.
Oh, yes, that's right.
And that potentially is a very big deal if that gets approved.
Can you explain what it is?
It basically says there's no state income tax, no excess taxes.
It repeals the income tax.
Repeals the income tax. So, figure that's, a $9 billion hole or thereabouts in the state budget. And so, I would argue that it was on the ballot a few years back. I want to say it was maybe 2002 or 2000, and it actually did very, very well. And the same group of people is back again and feeling maybe with a little more of a campaign and people's frustration. And obviously it's a challenging time in the economy right now, with foreclosures and people, home heating costs and gas costs. So we all have, I think, an obligation, those of us that have a concern that something like this might pass and the impacts it would mean, need to be careful of things that we do now that put pressure on increasing people's desire to see something like that pass. So if you go raise taxes through the roof right now, if you went out and said, let's go raise the income tax to 8% right now to pay for all these things, I guess you should probably help this thing get passed. So it's having that right balancing act, and being mindful that people are, facing a lot of economic pressures right now, and finding that appropriate level of taxation.
When we met with Stan the other night, Brad, she said not only did it get attention on that last ballot, it got 47% of the vote.
Right, which means that if you look back, it won in certain communities. If you get 47%, the likelihood is it was, I think a couple of my towns that won it and passed it.
Didn't lose one of mine.
Yeah. So we need to be mindful of that, particularly, and when it was on the ballot last time, I'm not sure if it may be as challenging an economic time. The only other two things I would touch on is, that I've worked on with Bruce's help is, like working on the bachelor school reimbursement and getting money for that. That's a piece of an equation to alleviate. Right now, without any reimbursement, the property taxpayer in North Reading is going to have to pay the full bill of this. But to the extent we're able to get some reimbursement, I think it lives up to the commitment that we all made to seek reimbursement, and alleviates that, which may mean the taxpayer not only feels that we lived up to our commitment, which is important, but is willing to maybe replace that with some other spending. And we're moving forward. I haven't had a chance to circle back with the superintendent. I know they had a meeting in January and trying to get the data and the information into the state. I've been in touch with Catherine Craven, going back in the email. She just had her 4th child, but she was on her BlackBerry a couple hours later and delivered her. And and every city and town is dealing with school board programs. You probably all read about Newton and their $200 million situation. But I am hopeful and confident that we're going to try to, we're going to get some money back. in the not too distant future. And it may even be a partial payment of what they certainly would qualify, and then go back through some of the paperwork. And I think I just assume get a partial payment, and then say if there's still some details to work out or a little bit more, let's do that, that's fine. And the other thing that Bruce and I worked on is just the J.T. Berry Center. I told Bob here, you know, you may see in the transcript, you know, the check is in the email, it's in the bank now, the town has the money. So the town got the $1.218 million for that. And with legislation that we worked on, we got a share of the net proceeds. I talked to Lincoln Properties and Gutierrez, they're working very aggressively and think it would be more attractive now to sell potentially the other side of the site now that there's been development up there and it's people can maybe have a better vision. That holds, if you look at that, if that's built at 600,000 square feet of commercial, it's gonna become a big taxpayer like you see like Teradyne and out there on Concord Street. In addition to which, if that goes forward, you get a $750,000 payment from the developer, and you get it back to the tax roll. And the way the legislation is set up is the town stands to receive 20% of the net proceeds of the sale price. So if it's $5 million, the town might get another check for $1 million, the way it's set up right now. So those things all impact, I think, in a positive way, things in the town. Sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly.
I would just add that I'm very optimistic about the bachelor reimbursement. I think a good job has been done at flowing information that we need to do, and I think the MSBA has been very positive and receptive to our entreats to try to get some reimbursement. So I agree with Brad. I think that cash in the hand is always better than a promise in the future. So hopefully we can get some partial reimbursement and then chase some of the remainder of it. But I feel pretty good about that. We're in a good position.
Can I open this up just a little bit, so what questions might be out there, and then, you know, we'll finish up by just talking about what we can do, as you said, in the future, when we have different pieces of legislation that you're proposing, if there's anything we can do to help, and we have a lot of willing people to support your efforts as much as we can, we appreciate your support. So I think we should just probably take the next 20 minutes or so and see if anyone has any particular questions they want to ask.
Eleanor Wanda, 15 Valley.
Can you speak up, please?
I'll do my best. It sounds like, you know, when you talk about changing the formula, that a lot of the towns that benefit from the way the formula is now are going to be fighting that change. And it doesn't sound like you're going to be able to get it done legislatively. Just like this ballot question that's coming up, who started that initiative? And is there something that the smaller cities and towns that aren't benefiting from the formula could initiate a ballot question that would be a state, you know, voted on the state? So, you know, it's not just North Reading.
I would say the ballot issue was started by a lady named Carla Howell, sort of a libertarian, sort of smaller government, no tax.
Run for governor?
And ran for governor. I would say, are you saying then maybe do a ballot question to address this issue? There are very strict guidelines, and I think that depending on how it's structured, and Bruce is an attorney, maybe a better eye, but I'm very careful, because even though we have an initiative process, when they created it, they didn't want to create a situation where, you know, the suburbs could put a ballot question on just affecting Boston, or Boston, because they have the population, to put a ballot question on affecting the suburbs. So that depending on how it's structured, the court may say it's appropriate or inappropriate.
Yeah, one of